15 years ago, Sarah Mitchell walked into St. Mary's Hospital for her night shift and was never seen again. Her car remained in the parking lot, her purse still in her locker, but she had simply vanished without a trace. Police investigated. Her family searched desperately, but no answers came. Then last month, while digitizing old hospital records, an archivist discovered something that would change everything and reveal a truth so shocking that it would shake the entire medical community to its core. Sarah Mitchell wasn't just any nurse. At 34, she had dedicated 12 years of her life to St. Mary's Hospital in Portland, Oregon. Her colleagues knew her as the nurse who would stay late to comfort a scared patient, the one who never complained about working Christmas or New Year's Eve, and the person who somehow always knew exactly what to say to a grieving family. But it was her dedication to the night shift that truly set Sarah apart. While most nurses tried to avoid the graveyard shift, Sarah volunteered for it. She said she loved the quiet hours, the way the hospital settled into a different rhythm after visiting hours ended. Her supervisor, Helen Rodriguez, would later tell investigators that Sarah was irreplaceable during those long, dark hours when the hospital felt more like a sanctuary than a medical facility. Sarah lived alone in a small apartment just 15 minutes from the hospital. She had never married, though she'd been engaged once to a fellow nurse named Michael, who had moved to Seattle 5 years earlier. They'd remained friends, texting occasionally about work or sharing memories of their time together. Sarah's life was simple, predictable, and exactly the way she liked it. Her routine was as consistent as clockwork. She'd arrive at the hospital at 10:45 p.m., 15 minutes before her shift began. She'd stop by the cafeteria for her usual coffee, black, with 2 sugars, and then head to the 3rd floor where she worked in the cardiac unit. Sarah would spend a few minutes reviewing patient charts with the evening shift nurse, then settle in for the night. The patients loved her. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who'd been in and out of the cardiac unit several times over the years, would always ask specifically for Sarah when she was admitted. "That girl has healing hands," she'd tell anyone who would listen. "She doesn't just give you medicine, she gives you hope." But on March 15th, 2008, Sarah's predictable world would be shattered in a way no one could have imagined. The evening of March 14th started like countless others for Sarah. She'd spent the day running errands, grocery shopping, and catching up on some reading. Around 9 p.m., she began her usual pre-work routine: a quick shower, her hair pulled back in the neat bun she always wore to work, and her favorite scrubs, the navy blue ones with small white flowers that a patient's granddaughter had complimented months earlier. Sarah grabbed her purse, checked that she had her hospital ID badge, and locked her apartment door at exactly 10:25 p.m. The drive to St. Mary's took her through familiar streets that she could navigate with her eyes closed. She parked in her usual spot in the employee parking garage, the same space she'd been using for over 3 years. The security cameras in the garage captured Sarah walking toward the hospital entrance at 10:41 p.m. She moved with her characteristic, quick, purposeful stride, her nursing bag slung over her shoulder. She looked completely normal. There was nothing in her demeanor to suggest anything was wrong. Inside the hospital, Sarah followed her routine perfectly. The cafeteria worker, Jorge, remembered serving her the usual coffee. She seemed fine, he would later tell police. Maybe a little tired, but nothing unusual. She asked about my daughter's school play, like she always did. Sarah remembered everything about everyone. At 10:52 p.m., Sarah took the elevator to the 3rd floor. The evening shift nurse, Patricia Wong, was waiting with the patient reports. They spent 8 minutes going over each case. Patricia was meticulous about her handoffs, and Sarah appreciated the thoroughness. "Room 312 is having trouble sleeping," Patricia noted. "Mrs. Chen in 315 is worried about her test results tomorrow, and Mr. Rodriguez in 318 keeps asking for his wife, but visiting hours are long over." Sarah nodded, already mentally planning her rounds. "I'll check on Mrs. Chen first, then see what I can do about getting Mr. Rodriguez to rest." Patricia gathered her things and headed for the elevator. As the doors closed behind her at 11:03 p.m., Sarah was alone with her patients and the quiet night ahead. Or so everyone thought. At 7:15 a.m. on March 15th, the day shift charge nurse, Maria Santos, arrived to find the third-floor cardiac unit in chaos. Sarah was nowhere to be found, but all her patients had been cared for throughout the night. Medications had been dispensed on schedule, vital signs had been recorded, and the detailed nursing notes were completed in Sarah's neat handwriting. But Sarah herself had vanished. Her coffee cup sat half empty at the nurse's station, still warm, to the touch. Her purse remained locked in her assigned locker in the staff changing room. Her car keys were inside the purse, and her car sat undisturbed in the parking garage, where she'd left it 9 hours earlier. Maria immediately called hospital. Security, then the police. Within an hour, St. Mary's was crawling with investigators, trying to piece together what had happened to Sarah Mitchell. The security footage told a strange story. The cameras had captured Sarah entering the hospital and taking the elevator to the third floor. But after that, she seemed to have disappeared. The third floor had cameras at both elevator banks and at the emergency stairwell, but none of them showed Sarah leaving. Detective Ray Coleman, who was assigned to the case, found it baffling. "It's like she just evaporated," he told his partner. "We've got her coming up, but never going down. She's not on any of the other floors, and there's no way out of that unit without passing a camera." The investigation expanded rapidly. Police interviewed every staff member who had been in the hospital that night. They spoke with security guards, cleaning crew, doctors, and other nurses. Everyone had the same story. Sarah was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she always did. Dr. Richard Hawthorne, the attending cardiologist who had worked with Sarah for 5 years, was particularly shaken by her disappearance. "Sarah was the most reliable person I've ever worked with," he told detectives. "If she said she was going to be somewhere, she was there. If she said she'd done something, it was done. The idea that she would just walk away from her patients, it's impossible." But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, it began to look like Sarah Mitchell had done exactly that. Sarah's parents, Robert and Linda Mitchell, lived in a small town 2 hours south of Portland. When the police called them on March 15th to report their daughter missing, Linda's first reaction was disbelief. "You must be mistaken," she told Detective Coleman over the phone. "Sarah would never abandon her patients. Something terrible has happened to her." Robert and Linda drove to Portland immediately, their minds racing with horrible possibilities. Had Sarah been kidnapped? Had she suffered some kind of medical emergency? The idea that she had simply walked away from her life was incomprehensible to them. They spent weeks in Portland, staying in a cheap motel near the hospital, plastering missing person flyers around the city. Linda would sit in the hospital cafeteria for hours, hoping against hope that Sarah would walk through the doors with some explanation for her absence. "She called us every Sunday at 2 p.m., Linda told anyone who would listen. "Every single Sunday for 12 years. She's never missed a call, never. If she was alive and able to call, she would have called." Sarah's younger brother David took a leave of absence from his job in Denver and moved temporarily to Portland to help with the search. He organized volunteer search parties, contacted every hospital and morgue in the region, and hired a private investigator when the police leads began to dry up. The private investigator, a former police detective named James Murphy, spent 3 months on the case. He interviewed everyone the police had interviewed, and several they hadn't. He examined Sarah's phone records, her bank accounts, her credit cards. Nothing had been touched since the night she disappeared. "In 30 years of doing this work, I've never seen anything like it," Murphy told the Mitchell family. "People don't just vanish. There's always a trace, always something. But with Sarah, it's like she never existed after 11 p.m. that night." The months dragged on. The police investigation stalled. The media attention faded. Life continued at St. Mary's Hospital, though Sarah's absence was felt deeply by everyone who had known her. Robert Mitchell died of a heart attack 2 years after Sarah's disappearance. Linda was convinced it was from the stress of not knowing what had happened to their daughter. Linda moved in with David in Denver, but she never stopped hoping that someday, somehow, they would find answers. As years passed, Sarah Mitchell's disappearance became one of those unsolved mysteries that Portland residents would occasionally remember and discuss. New nurses were hired at St. Mary's Hospital. The cardiac unit continued to operate. The night shift went on without Sarah's steady presence, but some people never forgot. Dr. Hawthorne, who had worked so closely with Sarah, found himself thinking about her case frequently. He had been deeply affected by her disappearance, not just professionally, but personally. Sarah had been more than a colleague. She had been a friend who had listened to his concerns about difficult cases and celebrated with him when their patients recovered. Helen Rodriguez, Sarah's former supervisor, kept Sarah's employee file long after hospital policy required her to dispose of it. Every year on the anniversary of Sarah's disappearance, Helen would pull out the file and read through Sarah's performance evaluations, her thank you letters from patients, her continuing education certificates. She couldn't bring herself to forget. Patricia Wong, the nurse who had been the last person to speak with Sarah, was haunted by their final conversation. She replayed it over and over in her mind, searching for any clue she might have missed. Had Sarah seemed nervous, distracted? In hindsight, Patricia convinced herself that Sarah had acted strangely, though she could never pinpoint exactly what had been different. The hospital administration, initially cooperative with the investigation, gradually became less willing to discuss the case. New management came and went. The current CEO, who had been hired 3 years after Sarah's disappearance, barely knew the story. To him, it was ancient history, irrelevant to the hospital's current operations. But in the basement of St. Mary's Hospital, in a storage room, filled with boxes of old records, Sarah's story was waiting to be rediscovered. By 2020, St. Mary's Hospital, like most medical facilities, was undergoing a massive digital transformation. Paper records that had been stored for decades were being scanned and digitized. It was a monumental task that required careful attention to detail and an understanding of medical record-keeping practices that had evolved significantly over the years. The hospital hired a specialized company called MedArchive Solutions to handle the digitization project. The company's team included archivists, IT specialists, and medical record experts who understood the complexities of converting decades of paper files into searchable digital formats. Jennifer Chen, a 28-year-old archivist with a master's degree in library science, was assigned to work on St. Mary's project. Jennifer had worked on similar hospital digitization projects before, but she had never encountered anything quite like what she found in the basement storage rooms of St. Mary's. The records were stored in thousands of boxes, organized by year and department, but not always consistently. Some boxes contained patient files, others held administrative documents, personnel records, and correspondence. Many of the boxes hadn't been opened in years, and some showed signs of water damage from a pipe leak that had occurred several years earlier. Jennifer approached the work methodically, sorting documents by type and date before scanning them. It was tedious, detail-oriented work, but she found it oddly satisfying. Each document told a small piece of the hospital's history, and Jennifer began to feel like she was uncovering a hidden story. In late February 2023, Jennifer was working on a box of administrative records from 2008 when she came across a folder that made her pause. It was labeled Incident Reports, March 2008, and was thicker than most of the other folders from that time period. Inside, she found the expected collection of incident reports, medication errors, patient falls, equipment malfunctions. But at the bottom of the folder was a document that didn't seem to belong. It was a handwritten note on hospital letterhead, dated March 16, 2008, just 1 day after Sarah Mitchell's disappearance. The note was brief, written in a hurried script that Jennifer had to squint to read. Meeting with Dr. H tomorrow at 6 a.m. Discuss disposal protocol. Package secured in sub-B storage. Will handle documentation, as discussed. MK. Jennifer stared at the note, trying to make sense of it. The date was significant. It was written during the height of the investigation into Sarah's disappearance. But what was disposal protocol. What kind of package needed to be secured? And who were Dr. H and MK? Jennifer's curiosity was piqued. She had been working on hospital digitization projects for 5 years, and she had developed a good instinct for recognizing unusual documents. This handwritten note felt important, though she couldn't immediately understand why. She set the note aside and continued working through the 2008 administrative files. But now, she was looking more carefully at each document. 3 hours later, she found something else that caught her attention. A work order for the hospital's maintenance department, dated March 18, 2008. The work order requested emergency cleaning and sterilization of Sub-B storage area. It was signed by someone with the initials MK and approved by someone identified only as Dr. H. Sub-B referred to the hospital's sub-basement, an area that Jennifer had never visited, but that she knew was used primarily for storage of medical equipment and supplies. The timing of the cleaning order, just 3 days after Sarah Mitchell's disappearance, seemed suspicious. Jennifer decided to do some research. She accessed the hospital's current staff directory and cross-referenced it with employee records from 2008. Finding staff members with those initials wasn't difficult. Dr. H was almost certainly Dr. Richard Hawthorne, the cardiologist who had worked closely with Sarah Mitchell. MK was likely Marcus Klein, who had been the hospital's facilities manager in 2008. But what really intrigued Jennifer was what she found when she searched for more information about Marcus Klein. According to the personnel records, Klein had resigned from his position abruptly in April 2008, just 1 month after Sarah's disappearance. His resignation letter cited personal reasons for his departure, and there was no forwarding address in his file. Jennifer knew she was potentially uncovering something significant, but she wasn't sure what to do with the information. The documents she had found could be completely innocent. Hospitals generate thousands of maintenance requests and incident reports, and the timing could be coincidental, but her instincts told her otherwise. Jennifer spent the weekend thinking about what she had discovered. She researched Sarah Mitchell's disappearance online, reading news articles and blog posts about the case. The more she learned about Sarah, her dedication to her patients, her close relationship with her family, her predictable routine, the more convinced she became that Sarah hadn't simply walked away from her life. On Monday morning, Jennifer made a decision that would change everything. She called the Portland Police Department and asked to speak with someone about a cold case. Detective Lisa Park had been with the Portland Police for 15 years, specializing in cold cases for the last 5. She had reviewed Sarah Mitchell's file several times over the years, always hoping to find something that previous investigators had missed. When Jennifer called about potentially relevant documents, Detective Park was immediately interested. They met at St. Mary's Hospital that afternoon. Jennifer led Detective Park down to the basement storage area and showed her the documents she had found. Park examined the handwritten note and the maintenance work order, her expression growing more serious as she realized the potential significance of what she was seeing. "I'm going to need to take these documents as evidence," Park told Jennifer, "and I'm going to need to interview some people. Do you know if Dr. Hawthorne still works here?" Jennifer checked the current staff directory. "Yes, he does. He's the chief of cardiology now." "What about Marcus Klein?" "He resigned in April 2008. I don't have any contact information for him in the files." Detective Park nodded, her mind already working through the implications. After 15 years, she finally had new leads in the Sarah Mitchell case. Detective Park spent 2 days preparing for her interview with Dr. Hawthorne. She reviewed every aspect of the original investigation, paying particular attention to Hawthorne's previous statements. In his initial interview in March 2008, he had described Sarah as a dedicated, reliable nurse who would never abandon her patients. He had seemed genuinely shocked by her disappearance and had cooperated fully with the investigation. But now, 15 years later, Park had questions that hadn't been asked before. She arranged to meet Dr. Hawthorne in his office on Wednesday afternoon. He was now 58 years old, with grey hair and the confident bearing of someone who had spent decades making life and death decisions. When Park showed him her badge, and explained that she wanted to discuss Sarah Mitchell's disappearance. His expression became guarded. "I've told the police everything I know about Sarah," he said carefully. "That was a very difficult time for all of us." Park showed him photocopies of the documents Jennifer had found. "Dr. Hawthorne, can you explain these documents to me?" Hawthorne examined the handwritten note and the maintenance work order, his face pale. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he looked up at Park with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I think I need to call my attorney," he said quietly. The words hung in the air like a confession. Park felt her pulse quicken. After 15 years, she was finally getting somewhere. "Dr. Hawthorne, you're not under arrest. You're free to leave at any time, and you're certainly free to call an attorney. But I'm hoping you'll help me understand what happened to Sarah Mitchell. Her family has been waiting 15 years for answers." Hawthorne was quiet for several minutes, staring at the documents on his desk. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. It wasn't supposed to happen the way it did. Detective Park felt her heart racing, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had conducted hundreds of interviews over her career, and she knew that this moment, when a suspect first began to open up, was crucial. One wrong word, one misplaced question, could shut down the conversation entirely. "What wasn't supposed to happen, Dr. Hawthorne?" she asked gently. Hawthorne rubbed his face with both hands, suddenly looking much older than his 58 years. "Sarah was never supposed to be hurt. We needed to keep her quiet." Park's training kicked in. She needed to get Hawthorne's statement on record, but she also needed to be careful about his rights. "Dr. Hawthorne, I want to make sure you understand that you're not required to speak with me. Anything you say could potentially be used in a legal proceeding. Do you understand that?" He nodded. "I understand. I've been carrying this secret for 15 years. I think I'm ready to tell the truth." Park pulled out her phone and set it to record. "Dr. Hawthorne, I'm going to record our conversation. Is that okay with you?" "Yes. Can you tell me what happened to Sarah Mitchell?" Hawthorne took a deep breath. "Sarah discovered something she wasn't supposed to discover, something that could have destroyed careers and sent people to prison. We thought we could handle it, quietly. But Sarah had a very strong moral compass. She wasn't going to let it go." "What did she discover?" "Marcus Klein and I were diverting medications from the hospital pharmacy. Pain medications mainly. OxyContin, morphine, fentanyl. We had a buyer who was paying us substantial amounts for these drugs." Park felt a chill run down her spine. Drug diversion was a serious crime, but it didn't typically result in murder. How did Sarah find out? She noticed discrepancies in the medication counts on her unit. Sarah was meticulous about everything, and she started keeping her own records when the numbers didn't add up. She came to me on March 14th, just before her shift started, and showed me what she had documented. "What did you do?" Hawthorne's voice broke slightly. "I tried to convince her to let me handle it internally. I told her that involving the police would hurt innocent people, that there might be a simple explanation. But Sarah said she had already made copies of her documentation and that she was going to report it to the hospital administration and the DEA the next morning." Park leaned forward. "So what happened during her shift that night?" "Marcus and we panicked. We knew that if Sarah's documentation was examined, it would expose everything. We'd both go to prison. Marcus said he knew a way to handle it, that he could make Sarah disappear without anyone getting hurt." "How?" Hawthorne was crying, now tears streaming down his face. "Marcus had access to the hospital's old tunnels. St. Mary's was built in the 1940s, and there's a network of service tunnels that connect different parts of the building. Most people don't even know they exist anymore." Park felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. "These tunnels aren't covered by the security cameras." No. Marcus knew them well because he'd been using them to move the stolen medications without being detected. He said we could use them to get Sarah out of the hospital without anyone seeing. But Sarah didn't want to leave. "No, we had to force her." Detective Park had interviewed hundreds of suspects over her career, but she had never felt quite the mix of disgust and sadness that she felt listening to Dr. Hawthorne's confession. Here was a man who had taken an oath to do no harm, confessing to a crime that had destroyed multiple lives. Dr. Hawthorne, I need you to tell me exactly what happened that night. Every detail. Hawthorne wiped his eyes and continued, his voice hollow. Around 2 a.m., Marcus came up to the 3rd floor through the service elevator. Sarah was doing her rounds, checking on patients. Marcus approached her and told her there was an emergency in the basement that required a nurse's immediate attention. Did she believe him? Sarah was always willing to help. She grabbed her medical bag and followed Marcus to the service elevator. But instead of taking her to a patient, he took her down to the sub-basement, to the old storage area. Park felt sick to her stomach, but she pressed on. What happened in the sub-basement? I was waiting there. We tried to convince Sarah to forget what she had discovered, to let us handle things quietly. We offered her money. We promised that we would stop the drug diversion. We begged her to consider the consequences for our families. But she refused. Sarah said that patients were being put at risk, that we had violated our oaths as healthcare providers. She said that people who were counting on pain medication for legitimate medical needs weren't getting what they needed because we were stealing it. She wouldn't compromise. Hawthorne paused, struggling to continue. Marcus said we couldn't let her leave. He said she would destroy us. I told him we needed to find another way, but Marcus had already made up his mind. What did he do? He injected Sarah with a paralytic agent, succinylcholine. It's a drug we use in surgery to temporarily paralyze patients during intubation. Sarah would have been conscious but unable to move or speak. Park felt her hands clenching into fists. The cruelty of using a medical drug to incapacitate a fellow healthcare worker was almost beyond comprehension. Then, what happened? Marcus said we had to wait for the drug to wear off, that we needed time to figure out our next steps. We put Sarah in one of the old storage rooms in the sub-basement. The rooms down there have heavy doors with locks that were installed decades ago for storing medical supplies. How long was she there? Several hours. Marcus kept checking on her, making sure she was still breathing. The paralytic agent was supposed to wear off by morning, and we hoped we could convince her to see reason. But something went wrong. Hawthorne nodded, tears flowing again. When Marcus checked on her around 6 a.m., Sarah was unconscious. We think she had an allergic reaction to the succinylcholine, or maybe the stress of the situation caused a cardiac event. Marcus tried to resuscitate her, but it was too late. Park felt a wave of anger wash over her. Sarah Mitchell died because you were afraid of going to prison for stealing drugs. We never meant for her to die. We just wanted to keep her quiet until we could figure out a solution. What did you do with her body? Hawthorne's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Marcus handled the disposal. He said it was better if I didn't know the details. All he told me was that no one would ever find her. After taking Dr. Hawthorne's full statement, Detective Park immediately began the process of tracking down Marcus Klein. The man who had been the facilities manager at St. Mary's Hospital in 2008 had seemingly vanished after his resignation, but Park was determined to find him. She started with the basic information in Klein's personnel file: social security number, previous addresses, emergency contact information. Klein had been 43 years old when he left St. Mary's, married, with 2 children. His emergency contact had been listed as his wife, Angela Klein. A record search revealed that Angela Klein had filed for divorce in June 2008, just 2 months after Marcus had resigned from the hospital. The divorce papers cited irreconcilable differences, but Park suspected there was more to the story. Angela Klein had remarried and was now Angela Patterson, living in Sacramento, California. Park called her and arranged to meet in person the following day. Angela was now 51 years old, a kindergarten teacher who had clearly built a new life for herself after her marriage to Marcus ended. When Park showed her badge and explained that she was investigating Sarah Mitchell's disappearance, Angela's reaction was immediate and telling. "I've been waiting 15 years for this phone call," she said quietly. They met at a coffee shop near Angela's school. She was a small woman with graying hair and tired eyes that suggested she had carried a heavy burden for many years. Mrs. Patterson, what can you tell me about your ex-husband's behavior in March and April of 2008? Angela stirred her coffee nervously. Marcus changed after that nurse disappeared. He became paranoid, jumpy. He would wake up in the middle of the night in cold sweats. He started drinking heavily. Did he tell you anything about Sarah Mitchell's disappearance? Not directly, but one night, about a week after it happened, he was drunk and he started talking about how sometimes people had to do terrible things to protect their families. He said that some secrets were too dangerous to tell. Park leaned forward. What did you think he meant? I suspected Marcus was involved in something illegal at the hospital. There were nights when he would come home with expensive things, jewelry for me, toys for the kids. And when I asked where the money came from, he would just say he was working extra shifts. When did you decide to leave him? The day I found out what he had done with Sarah Mitchell's body. Park's pulse quickened. He told you? Angela shook her head. He didn't tell me. I saw it. Angela Patterson's words sent a chill through Detective Park. After 15 years, she was finally going to learn what had happened to Sarah Mitchell's remains. Mrs. Patterson, I need you to tell me exactly what you saw. Angela took a shaky breath. It was in early April, about 3 weeks after that nurse disappeared. Marcus had been acting strange, paranoid. He was working late almost every night, and when he came home, he would go straight to the garage. What was he doing in the garage? I thought he was just working on projects. Marcus was always tinkering with things, fixing appliances, building shelves. But one night I heard strange noises coming from the garage. Not hammering or sawing, but grinding sounds. Park felt her stomach turn, but she pressed on. What did you do? I waited until Marcus fell asleep. Then I went out to the garage to see what he was working on. The smell hit me first. This horrible chemical smell mixed with something else. Something organic. What did you find? Angela's voice dropped to a whisper. Marcus had set up some kind of processing area in the garage. There were plastic sheets on the floor, metal containers, and industrial chemicals. And there was a large meat grinder that I had never seen before. Park felt bile rise in her throat. Did you see any human remains? There were pieces inside one of the containers. I couldn't tell what they were, but they weren't animal. I knew that much. What did you do? I ran back into the house and threw up. I was so scared, so shocked. I didn't know what to do. The next morning I acted like nothing had happened, but I started planning to leave. Why didn't you call the police? Angela started crying. Marcus was my husband, the father of my children, and I was terrified of what he might do if he found out that I knew. I thought if I could just get away from him, take the kids somewhere safe, then maybe I could figure out what to do. When did you leave? 2 weeks later. I told Marcus I was taking the kids to visit my sister in California for spring break, but once we got there, I never went back. Park nodded, understanding the impossible position Angela had been in. Did Marcus try to contact you after you left? He called constantly for the first few months, begging me to come back. He said he could explain everything, that he had been trying to protect our family, but I never spoke to him directly. All communication went through my divorce attorney. Do you know where Marcus is now? Angela shook her head. I haven't heard from him in over 10 years. The last I knew he was living somewhere in Arizona, but I don't have an address. Armed with Angela's information about Marcus Klein's possible location in Arizona, Detective Park expanded her search. She contacted law enforcement agencies throughout Arizona, sharing Klein's photo and description with missing persons units and detective divisions. The breakthrough came 3 days later. A detective in Phoenix called Park with promising news. A man matching Marcus Klein's description had been arrested 6 months earlier on drug possession charges. He had been using the name Martin Kowalski, but his fingerprints revealed his true identity. Marcus Klein was currently serving a 2-year sentence in Arizona State Prison for drug possession and distribution, charges that were eerily similar to the crimes that had led to Sarah Mitchell's death 15 years earlier. Park immediately arranged to fly to Arizona to interview Klein. She coordinated with the Maricopa County District Attorney's Office to ensure that Klein would be available for questioning and that any confession he made could be used in Oregon's prosecution of the case. The Phoenix detective who had arrested Klein, Detective Carlos Mendez, met Park at the airport and briefed her on Klein's case during the drive to the prison. Klein was running a small-time drug operation, Mendez explained. Nothing major, just selling prescription painkillers to addicts. But when we searched his apartment, we found journals going back several years. Weird stuff, like confessions, to crimes we'd never heard of. Did he mention anything about a murder? Nothing specific, but there were a lot of references to guilt and nightmares. The guy seemed to be falling apart mentally. At the prison, Park was led to a small interview room where Marcus Klein was waiting. He was now 58 years old, thin and haggard, with the hollow-eyed look of someone who had been battling addiction for years. When Park introduced herself and explained that she was investigating Sarah Mitchell's disappearance, Klein's reaction was immediate. He broke down, crying. "I've been waiting for this day for 15 years, he said through his tears. I knew someone would eventually figure it out. Park read Klein his rights and confirmed that he understood them. Then she turned on her recording device and began the interview that would finally bring closure to one of Portland's most haunting cold cases. Marcus Klein's confession was detailed, horrific, and ultimately corroborated everything that Dr. Hawthorne had told Detective Park. But Klein's version included the gruesome details that Hawthorne had claimed not to know. After Sarah died in that storage room, Dr. Hawthorne panicked, Klein began. He wanted to call 911 to somehow explain what had happened, but I knew that would destroy both of us. We had already committed kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment. If Sarah's body was found, we'd both go to prison for murder. So, you convinced Dr. Hawthorne to help you dispose of her body? No, I told him I would handle everything, that it was better if he didn't know the details. That way, if we were ever questioned, he could honestly say he didn't know what happened to Sarah after she died. Park felt sick listening to Klein's matter-of-fact tone as he described planning the cover-up of Sarah's death. What did you do with her body? I knew the hospital service tunnels better than anyone. There are sections of those tunnels that haven't been used in decades, places where no one ever goes. I moved Sarah's body to a section near the old boiler room and left it there for 3 days while I figured out what to do next. Then what? Klein's voice dropped even lower. I realized that the body would eventually be discovered, even in the old tunnels. So I decided to dispose of it completely. How? I had access to all the hospital's equipment and supplies. I took Sarah's body to my garage at home and I dismembered it. Then I used industrial equipment to process the remains. Park had to take a moment to compose herself. The brutality of what Klein was describing was almost beyond comprehension. What did you do with the remains after that? I disposed of them in multiple locations over several weeks. Some went into the hospital's medical waste system, mixed in, with surgical waste that would be incinerated. Other parts I buried in remote locations around Oregon. I made sure that no single location contained enough evidence to identify Sarah. What about her personal belongings? Her scrubs, her shoes, her jewelry, anything that could be traced back to her. I destroyed in my garage using acid. The only thing I kept was her hospital ID badge. Why did you keep that? Klein looked up at Park with haunted eyes. I don't know. Maybe as some kind of sick reminder of what I had done. I've carried it with me for 15 years. Park felt a mixture of revulsion and professional satisfaction. Klein's confession was providing the closure that Sarah's family desperately needed, even if the details were horrific. Mr. Klein, after you disposed of Sarah's body, how did you and Dr. Hawthorne continue working together? We barely spoke to each other after that night. Dr. Hawthorne was consumed with guilt. He stopped the drug diversion operation immediately and became paranoid that we would be caught. I think the stress nearly drove him to a nervous breakdown. Is that why you resigned from the hospital? I couldn't handle being there anymore. Every day I would walk past the cardiac unit where Sarah had worked, and I would think about what we had done to her. I started having nightmares, panic attacks. I began drinking heavily just to get through each day. Klein paused, wiping tears from his eyes. The worst part was seeing Sarah's colleagues searching for her, putting up missing person flyers, organizing search parties. They thought she had just disappeared, that maybe she was still alive somewhere. I wanted to tell them the truth, but I was too much of a coward. What happened after you left Portland? I moved around a lot. I couldn't stay in one place for very long because the guilt was eating me alive. I started using drugs to numb the pain, which led to selling drugs to support my habit. It's been a downward spiral for 15 years. Park leaned back in her chair, processing everything Klein had told her. Mr. Klein, do you still have Sarah's ID badge? He nodded. It's in my personal effects here at the prison. I've never been able to throw it away. Detective Park's flight back to Portland was one of the longest of her life. She had the closure that Sarah Mitchell's family had been waiting for, but she also had to deliver news that would be devastating in its finality. For 15 years, Linda Mitchell and her son David had held on to hope that Sarah might still be alive somewhere. Now Park had to tell them that their worst fears had been realized. She called David Mitchell, who was now living in Seattle with his own family, and arranged to meet with him and his mother the following day. Linda was now 78 years old and in declining health, but she had never stopped hoping for news about her daughter. The meeting took place at David's home, a comfortable suburban house where Linda had been living since her health began to fail. When Park arrived, she found a frail, elderly woman whose eyes still held the same desperate hope they had carried for 15 years. Detective Park, Linda said, gripping her hands with surprising strength. Do you have news about my Sarah? Park sat down across from Linda and David, steeling herself for one of the most difficult conversations of her career. Mrs. Mitchell, David, I need to tell you that we've solved Sarah's case. We know what happened to her. Linda's face lit up with hope. Is she alive? Park's heart broke as she shook her head. No, Mrs. Mitchell, I'm so sorry. Sarah died on the night she disappeared. The silence that followed was deafening. Linda's face crumpled, and David moved to put his arms around his mother. They had known, on some level, that this day might come, but the finality of it was still devastating. How did she die? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Park had prepared for this question, knowing that the family deserved to know the truth, but also wanting to spare them the most horrific details. Sarah discovered that 2 hospital employees were stealing medications. When she threatened to report them, they kidnapped her and held her in the hospital's basement. They gave her a drug to keep her quiet, but she had an adverse reaction and died. Who did this to her? Linda asked, her voice filled with a rage that Park had rarely heard from a grieving mother. Dr. Richard Hawthorne, who worked with Sarah, and Marcus Klein, who was the hospital's facilities manager. Both men have confessed to their roles in Sarah's death. David was quiet for a long moment, processing the information. What will happen to them now? Dr. Hawthorne is being charged with kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and manslaughter. Mr. Klein is being charged with those same crimes, plus abuse of a corpse and evidence tampering. Both men will likely spend the rest of their lives in prison. Linda looked up at Park with tears streaming down her face. Can you tell me, did Sarah suffer? It was the question Park had been dreading. She thought about Klein's description of Sarah being paralyzed but conscious, trapped in that basement storage room for hours before she died. The medical examiner believes that Sarah lost consciousness quickly, Park said, choosing her words carefully. She wouldn't have been in pain for very long. It wasn't entirely true, but it was a kindness that Park felt Linda deserved. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and emotionally draining for everyone involved. Dr. Richard Hawthorne was arrested at St. Mary's Hospital while making his evening rounds, a scene that shocked his colleagues and patients. Marcus Klein was extradited from Arizona to face charges in Oregon. Both men were represented by experienced criminal defense attorneys who initially explored the possibility of plea bargains. However, the strength of the evidence, including their own recorded confessions, made it clear that lengthy prison sentences were inevitable. The media attention was intense. Sarah Mitchell's disappearance had captured Portland's attention 15 years earlier, and the resolution of the case brought renewed interest from local and national news outlets. The story had everything that fascinated the public: a beloved nurse, trusted medical professionals who had betrayed their oaths, and a cold case finally solved through determined detective work. Dr. Hawthorne's attorney tried to argue that his client had been manipulated by Klein, that he had never intended for Sarah to be harmed, and that he had cooperated fully with the investigation once the truth came to light. But the prosecution argued that Hawthorne's medical expertise made him equally responsible for Sarah's death. He had known the risks of using succinylcholine on an unwilling victim, and he had participated in the cover-up that had denied Sarah's family closure for 15 years. Klein's defense was even more challenging. His attorney could only argue for leniency based on his client's eventual cooperation and his obvious mental anguish over what he had done. But Klein's detailed disposal of Sarah's body was so methodical and cruel that it was difficult to generate sympathy for him. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, was determined to seek the maximum penalties allowed. Under Oregon law, Walsh had prosecuted many murder cases during her career, but she told reporters that the Sarah Mitchell case was particularly heinous because of the betrayal of trust involved. Sarah Mitchell went to work that night to help people, Walsh said during a press conference. She was dedicated to her patients and to her profession. The defendants not only killed her, but they did so to cover up their own criminal behavior. They robbed her family of 15 years of closure, and they deserved to spend the rest of their lives in prison. Dr. Richard Hawthorne's trial began in September 2023, nearly 8 months after his arrest. The courtroom was packed with Sarah's family members, her former colleagues from St. Mary's Hospital, and members of the media. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented evidence of the drug diversion scheme that had motivated the crime, expert testimony about the effects of succinylcholine, and recordings of Hawthorne's confession to Detective Park. Perhaps most powerful was the testimony of Sarah's former colleagues, who described her dedication to her patients and her strong moral character. Helen Rodriguez, Sarah's former supervisor, broke down in tears as she described the impact of Sarah's disappearance on the cardiac unit. "Sarah was the heart of our team," Rodriguez testified. "She was the person we all looked up to, the nurse, who would stay late to comfort a scared patient or come in early to help with a difficult case. When she disappeared, it felt like we had lost our moral center." The defense's strategy was to portray Hawthorne as a man who had made a terrible mistake, but who had been manipulated by the more cunning Klein. They brought in character witnesses who testified to Hawthorne's years of dedicated service to his patients and his reputation as a skilled cardiologist. But the prosecution countered with evidence of Hawthorne's active participation in the drug diversion scheme and his decision to help cover up Sarah's death rather than calling for help when she collapsed. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Hawthorne was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Marcus Klein's trial began 2 months later. His case was even more clear-cut, as his confession had included graphic details about dismembering and disposing of Sarah's body. The prosecution argued that Klein's actions after Sarah's death showed a level of premeditation and cruelty that warranted the harshest possible sentence. Klein's defense attorney tried to argue that his client had been suffering from a mental breakdown at the time of the crime, but the methodical way he had disposed of Sarah's remains contradicted claims of diminished capacity. Klein was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the months following the trials, Linda Mitchell's health continued to decline. The stress of the legal proceedings combined with her advanced age, had taken a significant toll on her. But those who knew her said that finally learning the truth about Sarah's fate had brought her a measure of peace that she hadn't experienced in 15 years. Linda died peacefully in her sleep in February 2024, almost exactly 1 year after Jennifer Chen had discovered the documents that broke the case open. David Mitchell said that his mother's final months had been easier because she no longer had to wonder what had happened to Sarah. For 15 years, Mum lived with the hope that Sarah might still be alive somewhere, David said at Linda's funeral. That hope kept her going, but it also tortured her. At least in her final months, she knew the truth. She knew that Sarah hadn't chosen to abandon her family, that she had died trying to do the right thing. The Mitchell family established a scholarship fund at the nursing school where Sarah had trained, providing financial assistance to students who demonstrated the same commitment to patient care that had defined Sarah's career. The Sarah Mitchell Memorial Scholarship had provided assistance to dozens of nursing students by its first anniversary. St. Mary's Hospital also implemented new policies and procedures designed to prevent the kind of drug diversion that had led to Sarah's death. The hospital hired additional pharmacy oversight staff, installed new security measures in medication storage areas, and required two-person verification for all controlled substance transactions. Dr. Patricia Wong, the nurse, who had been the last person to speak with Sarah before her death, became an advocate for hospital safety and transparency. She testified before the Oregon State Legislature in support of stronger penalties for healthcare professionals who abuse their positions of trust. Sarah Mitchell died because she was trying to protect patients, Wong told the legislators. The least we can do is make sure that her death leads to changes that will protect other healthcare workers who have the courage to speak up when they see wrongdoing. Jennifer Chen continued working on the digitization project at St. Mary's Hospital, but the Sarah Mitchell case had changed her forever. She had always known that the documents she worked with told stories, but she had never imagined that she would uncover a story as tragic and compelling as Sarah's. The discovery had also changed how Jennifer approached her work. She now paid closer attention to seemingly routine documents, understanding that they might contain clues to unsolved mysteries or forgotten injustices. "I used to think of myself as just someone who scanned old papers," Jennifer reflected in an interview with a local newspaper. "But now I understand that archivists are really detectives of history. We're preserving stories that might otherwise be lost forever." Jennifer had been contacted by several other hospitals interested in having her review their archived documents for potential cold case evidence. She had also been approached by law enforcement agencies looking for archivists who could help them digitize and analyze old case files. The Sarah Mitchell case had opened up an entirely new career path for Jennifer, one that combined her skills as an archivist with her newfound passion for seeking justice for forgotten victims. But perhaps most importantly, Jennifer had learned that every document tells a story, and that sometimes those stories need to be told, no matter how difficult or disturbing they might be. 5 years after the resolution of Sarah Mitchell's case, her story continues to resonate throughout the medical community and beyond. Nursing schools across the country now teach the Sarah Mitchell case as an example of the ethical challenges that healthcare professionals may face and the importance of speaking up when witnessing wrongdoing. The cardiac unit at St. Mary's Hospital displays a memorial plaque in Sarah's honor, recognizing her dedication to patient care and her ultimate sacrifice in defense of her professional ethics. New nurses who join the unit are told Sarah's story as part of their orientation, ensuring that her legacy continues to inspire future generations of healthcare workers. Detective Lisa Park, who had spent so many years working cold cases, said that the Sarah Mitchell investigation was one of the most satisfying of her career. "It's rare in this job to be able to provide families with the kind of closure that the Mitchell family received," Park reflected. "Most cold cases remain cold, forever, but sometimes, if you're patient and persistent, the truth eventually comes to light." Park continued working cold cases until her retirement in 2025. But she often said that the Sarah Mitchell case had reminded her why she became a detective in the first place. To speak for victims who could no longer speak for themselves. The story of Sarah Mitchell serves as a reminder that evil can hide behind trusted faces and respected professions, but it also demonstrates that the truth has a way of emerging even after many years. Sarah's dedication to her patients and her unwavering moral courage ultimately led to justice, not just for herself, but for all the patients who might have been harmed by the drug diversion scheme she died trying to expose. In the end, Sarah Mitchell's greatest victory was not just the conviction of her killers, but the knowledge that her death had meaning, that it led to changes that would protect other healthcare workers and patients for generations to come. Her story reminds us that sometimes the most ordinary people, a night shift nurse doing a job with dedication and compassion, can become heroes in ways they never intended or imagined. And in a world where cynicism often prevails, Sarah Mitchell's story stands as a testament to the power of doing what's right, even when it comes at the ultimate cost. The truth, as Sarah Mitchell knew, is always worth fighting for, even when that fight costs everything.